All right, let's keep going. We are up to part 7. Man, this is a long chapter. Part 7 of chapter 12, the post classical era of Europe. So, the Hanseatic League, or also known as the Hansa, starts in the second half of the post classical era. And basically, what we see is that in the Baltic Sea, which is up here, and the North Sea, which is up here, we're gonna see a organization form, an agreement between all the different cities, right, from London to Hamburg to Danzig to Novgorod, and they're gonna all agree to trade with each other, right? So this is kind of like a mutual agreement between trading cities in Northern Europe, and they're going to kind of like control the trade, the maritime trade of Northern Europe, and they're going to trade other, various goods like timber, grains, leather, and salted fish. Now, at first, this trade network doesn't seem all that impressive because it's only within, or it's an intra-regional trade network, right, within Europe only. And when you compare it to like the Mediterranean trade network, it's much smaller in scale. But this shows us that by the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, the Europeans are able to trade with each other and trade outside of Europe more and more, and it's gonna it's gonna give opportunities for people to invest and gain profit and make money. The Hanseatic League, like I mentioned earlier, is often called Hansa. Right here, we see all the members of Hansa, and each city had to, had to apply and they had to follow rules. So they set up like standards, and if you didn't meet those standards, then you could get kicked out, and you had to pay extra if you weren't if you weren't a member of the league. And these ships are going to start incorporating sailing technology, maritime technology that came from other parts of the world, right? And little by little, they're gonna get bigger and larger and expand more. We're also going to see in these large trading cities that are growing in Europe the formations of guilds, right? So what is a guild? Is an organized labor union, right? So every like occupation, every artisan or craftsman is gonna have a guild, right? Blacksmith, tailors, brewers, bakers, and so on. So they're gonna set the standards or the requirements in order to move up in that profession. So at a young age, you might become an apprentice, like a baker's apprentice. Then, when you're old enough or you've had enough experience, you might become a journeyman, right? Opening up your own shop. The final level is to be a master craftsman, right? Where you create a masterpiece. And then you can take on an apprentice, you could teach the next generation. This organization of workers, they helped each other. So, for example, if one of the blacksmith dies, then the other blacksmiths are going to support the family of the person who passed away. They're going to also control prices, right? Because if all the blacksmiths agree about how much a sword costs, or all the cobblers or shoemakers agree how much to sell their shoes, they get to control the prices. And you can kind of see how this is going to give them a lot of power, political power, because if you're a king or you're lord of a city, and all the blacksmiths are going to charge you extraordinary high prices, there's not much you can do, right? So they can control prices. They're going to control job openings, right? So if in a city you only need 10 locksmiths, and then a new locksmith comes in and tries to open up shop, the guild will say, no, you can't open up shop. We got to kick you out. You're not allowed because that's too much. We don't need 10. We don't need 11. The most we need is 10. Also, they ensure the quality of the manufactured goods. So, for example, the brewers, right, who make beer, they might have to pass a test. They might have to send their samples for approval to the guild. And if the guild says, your product isn't up to task, isn't up to standards, they might kick you out or they might, punish you. The whole point is that we see this active organization in the production and the sales and the control of goods, right? Which again, these are new ideas and new techniques in Europe that did not exist prior to this time period. Again, of course, we see the growth of the cities, and part of this is going to be the growth of the middle class, which is sometimes known as the burghers. The burghers are going to be merchants. Remember, in the earlier time period in the Dark Ages of Europe, there wouldn't have been merchants whatsoever because there wouldn't have been any trade, and the towns would have been super small. But now these towns are getting larger and larger. But then we have this concern, right? Because remember, we still have that old social structure. We have the nobility, we have the knights, we have the serfs and the peasants, right at the bottom. So where do the merchants fall under, right? And merchants they're not peasants. They're probably educated. They're probably wealthier and they probably have skills. So are they peasants? But they're certainly not nobility either. So what are they? So that's where we see the growth of the middle class, right? A new group is formed in European society. And people who live in cities, the townspeople, the city folk, right? They don't want to be serfs. They don't want to be peasants. They don't want to be have the same restrictions, like being tied to the land. So once they are able to afford it, they're able to gain independence. They're able to buy their freedom essentially, where they don't have to pay taxes to the Lord or pay tribute to the Lord and stuff like that. So we see, the growth of this new social class, right? The middle class of Europe, and it's going to steadily grow, right? And it is going to coincide with the growth of trade, right? One occurs with the other. We're also going to see the towns are going to get bigger and bigger and more complicated, right? We're going to see some levels of urbanization, but even at this time, right, the largest cities in Europe, right, in the late post-classical era, they're not going to compare to the huge cities of like Baghdad or Chang'an or Guangzhou or Delhi, right? Those cities are going to be humongous. All right, the European city is going to be larger than before, but not as much. All right, so feudal society. Remember, this was the old social structure, the upper class, and then the peasants. But now again, there's going to be a new one, right? The middle class is slowly going to grow there, right? And it's going to be peasants who are going to rise up to become merchants and artisans and stuff like that, and become the new middle class. All right, let's talk about gender roles. All right, so here we see in this painting a woman working as a blacksmith, and that happened quite frequently, where women in urban cities were able to gain more opportunities. They could join guilds. They could be artisans like blacksmiths, right? But those opportunities were very limited, right? It wasn't very frequent. Um, More common was becoming a nun. Many women chose to become a nun as an alternative to becoming a wife and a mother and a home and a caregiver and stuff like that. When it comes to education, some upper class women were educated. Even less middle class merchants women might be educated, and definitely peasants, poor people, serfs would not have been educated whatsoever. Of course, Europe is going to be a patriarchal society. That's not going to change. And there's going to be these ideas of chivalry, right? About the way knights are supposed to treat women, how gentlemen are supposed to behave around women, and they're promoted, but they're not really like follow through. Knights really don't live up to their code of honor. But yet we have a lot of like literature and paintings and poems and stuff like that, especially stuff like King Arthur and the Legends of King Arthur, about how knights are supposed to go fight, for their lady, and how they're supposed to like be loyal and stuff like that. And one of the big sponsors of these type of stories, or we call it patron, who supported the storytellers and the authors and the writers and the poets, who came up with this, was this woman called Eleanor of Aquitaine, a very rich woman in France. She was married to a king, and she was a big sponsor of these type of stories of chivalry. But again, those were kind of like idealistic goals or beliefs. It wasn't really based in realism. Some of the people who passed these stories and spread it, and they would go from town to town. They're called the Troubadours. They would, sing these songs and poems and plays as a form of entertainment. They would go town to town, spreading these ideas about chivalry and bravery and knighthood and stuff like that. All right. We also see with the growth of cities, the growth of universities. The first universities are going to be established in Europe, and this is what a classroom would have looked like. Right, so you have your professor up here; he's going to read from you, and you're sitting in these long tables, kind of like just writing stuff down. Right. Obviously, you can tell that religion is going to play a major role when it comes to universities. So originally, we started having what are called cathedral schools. So you're gonna have the cathedrals, which are large churches in Europe. They're gonna start developing like a school with a curriculum. Like you got to teach all these different classes in order to graduate. And over time, the middle class is gonna want to become educated because it is financially beneficial to become educated, to be able to read and write and do math and stuff like that. And so we see that the first universities are going to be in cathedrals. So, for example, there's going to be Cathedral of Paris, and that's where the first university of Paris is. Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, that's in Italy. Those are going to be the first kind of major universities of Europe. So even though there's a lot of studying, most of it's going to either be theology or philosophy, grammar, writing, um, not too much math, not too much science, but it was more other subjects. And the people who are going to run these schools are going to be monks, right? Monastic orders. And because remember, the monks have always had, and the priests, the clergy of the church, they've always had that role in education, and now they're going to kind of continue that role over time. And in fact, these cathedral schools and these universities, they're officially considered guilds, right? Because all the teachers, all the professors in these schools and universities, um, they work together to come up with the curriculum and to come up with the requirements for graduation. And once you pass all these requirements, then you yourself can become a teacher, can become a professor to teach the next generation. So they're kind of similar to what guilds would have been for craftsmanship. Now, one of the major kind of academic advancements in Europe is something called scholasticism. It is created by a famous philosopher and theologian. Theologian means that they studied religion. His name was Saint Thomas of Aquinas. Here we see him. And Saint Thomas, he what he basically does is that he goes back and he studies the Greeks and the writings of the Romans and the Greeks and the philosophers, and he starts kind of like picking apart what they were arguing, what they were saying, and trying to see how it connects with the Christian belief, the Christian faith, or the Catholic faith. And he says that basically that if you are looking to study the world and use your rational mind, your scientific way of thinking, your critical thinking, if you use that way to understand the world, then that goes with the church, because God creates the world and you have to kind of like understand it to live in it. Uh, but even though he comes up with this idea of scholasticism, combining these two things, right, Christian with Greco-Roman with classical thinking, most of the church officials reject it because they want people to simply accept whatever the church says. Since the church is the holder of education and knowledge, they don't want people to question what they're teaching. They just want people to accept it. So that's going to be an ongoing conflict between the church and education, between church and eventually sciences, all the way into the 20th century. So again, St. Thomas, he's going to use works of Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers and combine them with the Christian faith. And this is one of his famous reasonings, right? To try to prove the existence of God. He basically says that, the universe exists and that is proof that God exists because the universe must have come from something, and the only thing powerful enough to create that universe is God. So that was his logic in trying to use the Greek and Roman way of thinking and apply it to the Christian beliefs. We're also going to see the growth of religious orders during this time, um, and churches and religion is going to be, of course, majorly important in the lives of the Europeans. We're going to see Gothic cathedrals, these huge, 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 super tall structures. And again, you could see the symbolism behind the structures, right? They're taller and taller because they're trying to get to the heavens. And each major city is going to have a cathedral, and they're going to build them larger than the city next to them, because they want to show their devotion to God. And this, of course, would be the headquarters, the offices of where a bishop would live. And this is the main form of architecture, what we call the High Middle Ages, right? Which is roughly, the 1200s all the way to the 1400s. And of course, some of you might recognize this, even though there's no hunchback, but this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Notre Dame in Latin means Our Lady, and that is reference to, of course, the Virgin Mary. So inside the Gothic cathedrals, even though most of us, when we think Gothic, we think darkness and black eyeliners and black lipsticks and nail polish, but Gothic actually, when it comes to architectural standards, is quite bright, right? Because they have these huge walls that can be sustained by, or you can have windows in these huge walls, these stained glass windows. So you're gonna see a lot of light coming in, and that's gonna be a very unique quality of Gothic architecture. We're also going to see the increased popularity of pilgrimages, right, which is, of course, a religious journey. And the main kind of like location, or the main thing to go to, is to look at relics. A relic is an artifact that remains of a saint. So you're going to have like the saint's finger, the saint's bones, the saint's scarves, the saint's clothing, their skull, and they believe that these saints had these like supernatural, superhuman, saintly connection to God. So if you are in the mere presence of their remains, of their relics, then you yourself can have that close connection to God. Whether or not these relics were authentic is another story, but the pilgrims believed in it, so they would travel across from city to city, to kind of like pray in front of these different saints, and of course you can imagine people are going to take advantage of those who are very you know very believing, right, very religious. So we see pilgrimages across these countries, right? And again, these activities of pilgrimages that wouldn't have existed during the Dark Ages, where it would have been nearly impossible for them to travel. One of the most famous relics is something called the Holy Thorn Reliquary. And here you see the thorn right there. And this was purchased by the King of France. It was considered the most expensive object ever purchased in European history. In that point, this is like in the 1200s. And basically, the King of France buys this thorn because he believed that this thorn was the thorn, one of the many thorns that pierced the head of Jesus during the crucifixion. Um, and again, whether this is the official one or if this is just some piece of wood, is up to debate. But that's what they believed, right? And the king was willing to pay for it, and of course he's gonna show it off because that's what their king does, right? Shows off his devotion, shows off his wealth. All right, so that's it for part 7. We have one more final part, and then we're done. Thanks for watching. See you next time.